Hello, my name is OR Frazier, and the following is a short story I've written. I hope you enjoyed as much as I did when imagining the grim little tale and putting it to paper. This short story is called Hunted. Now, let us begin. Run. It was the only thought racing through the man's mind as he sprinted through the frozen forest, leaving a damning trail of broken brush and heavy footprints behind in the deep snow. All he could hear was his heavy breathing and the drum of his heartbeat. Run. He'd managed to kill some of the men who'd unjustly incarcerated him. The absolute gall of these men, abducting him from his midnight stroll. Didn't they know who he was? How much his name was worth? They hadn't cared, taking his fine fur coat, rings, and even his shoes, before throwing him into a dark, cold dungeon. The brutes had at least the decency not to pluck the gold buttons from his shirt, finely crested with his family's equestrian insignia. But the improprieties towards his character didn't cease there. To add even more insult, they continuously ignored his demands to meet with their leader, who still refused to show his cowardly face. Well, no more! They would see how a noble from his lordship's court attained his position. Finally, an opportunity came. Grabbing his jailer through the iron bars, he managed to strangle the buffoon and appropriate the keys, taking the man's boots once free. Fitting or not, they were better than his bare feet. He caught another guard completely by surprise as he sprinted down the narrow stone hall towards freedom, and after a squabble, he managed to pry the man's dagger from his leathery hands and drive the blade deep into his lung. The bloody corpse slid down the wall and slumped on the cold granite floor. There was shouting behind him. A horn blew in the distance, a terrible sound which turned his blood colder than the snow. He knew who his captor was. If only he'd taken the time to pull the weapon out! His oversized boots slipped on an exposed wet rock, sending him tumbling down a steep slope, barely avoiding the exposed roots of a pine. He could feel small cuts all over his sweating face, but he didn't have time to dwell on them. Quickly on his feet, he pressed his aching body forward. The sun was barely visible beneath the cloudy sky, though it was enough for the man to get his bearing. If he could just escape south far enough. A crossbow bolt whizzed by his face, less than an inch from his hazel eye. He didn't turn around, knowing exactly who was pursuing him, hunting him. The man dashed deeper into the tree line to break the vision of his pursuer. The forest grew thicker, and the gnarled, twisting brush reached out to snatch him, tearing down his worn pants and piercing his flesh as he boorishly forced his way through. There would be no way his pursuer could follow him on horseback. The brush finally released him at a bank of a frozen river. There was no time to check its thickness. The man made a mad dash across the ice, barely keeping his footing. If he could just get across! A sudden, agonizing pain shot through his leg, and the man fell flat on the ice, which moaned under the sudden stress. A bolt had shattered his kneecap. There was laughter echoing from the shore of the river. The wounded man began to crawl. Damn the leg! He just had to make it to the other side. If he could... Another bolt shot cleanly through his other leg. He cried out as his blood eagerly covered the frozen surface. The laughter continued. Crippled, he continued dragging himself across the frozen lake inches at a time, leaving behind thick, sanguine streaks. His body begged him to yield, yet, with every bit of his being, he willed himself forward. He had to warn the Duke of the abhorrent inhumanities at work here. Perhaps his pursuer was out of range. Maybe his assailant had given up. By the grace of God, he'd managed to crawl across the surface of the icy river. Relief washed over him as his trembling, bony hands felt the frozen earth underneath. However, his legs were still bleeding profusely. Quickly, he ripped parts of his shirt off and tied up the wounds, the once azure linen quickly staining crimson. Fighting off dizziness, He dug his hands deep into the mud and the snow, dragging himself up the forested bank, and for a moment his spirits were lifted. A road! A stagecoach! Fervently, he pulled his body forward, crawling to the side of the road and waving frantically, shouting in their direction. "Help! Help me!" he cried as loud as he could. The driver of the stagecoach made a sharp whistle, and the white horses came to a halt. Fate was finally on his side. The snow began to fall steadily, becoming a blinding, silencing shroud. How lucky he had been to find the road and reach these passers-by before the snowfall. He didn't care who his saviors were, so long as they could get him back to the settlement in the south. He had to warn the Duke of the atrocities committed here. There would be a riot, a hanging. Before the band could process another thought, a bolt found its mark between his eyes. A tall figure emerged from the snowy forest, admiring his latest sport. Adjusting the silver-plated crossbow on his back, he kneeled to get a better look at his latest kill. "All the way to the road! That's a new record, isn't it, Arios?" A sulking figure exited the stagecoach. "Yes, master." "Get some men from the manor to clean up this unsightly mess. My family is coming for dinner tonight, and you know how dear father wanders. I shall not have him speaking poorly of my decorum." "And what of the body?" "My pets are quite famished." As the carriage and its quarry trailed towards an imposingly tall silhouette of a castle in the distance, a grunting servant reluctantly cleaned the road of any evidence. However, in his hurry to return to the warmth of his station and escape the heavy snowfall, a small golden button engraved with the crest of a stallion was overlooked, buried in the snow in the middle of the road. I hope you enjoyed this story, and I hope there'll be more to come in the future. Thanks for hanging out with me. See you next time.